obviously they slow down and take a little more too before they try to open that parachute. So I think he chose the right parachute, but it could have been by chance. Like, let's say, for example, there was one good parachute, one bad parachute, 50-50 to choose the right one. And was there any indication that he knew what was inside the packs? By pack, I mean the harness and the container. What's inside the pack is the canopy. Did he even know what was inside the one that he picked? Richard Tosaw, a retired FBI agent and an attorney, wrote a book about the D.B. Cooper paper, The Mystery. He was the first guy who published the complete list of all the serial numbers, and there were a few errors in it. And he has one of the flight attendants, I believe Tina Mucklow, in fact, noted that in Tosaw's version, Tina noted that D.B. Cooper inspected the parachute rigs and took out packing cards. Most people outside of skydiving don't even know what a packing card is. It's something signed by the rigger that identifies the type of rig, the serial number, what they did to it, and when they did it. And I think if that's true, then Cooper absolutely had some involvement with parachute. And the trouble is, you can't tell if it's true or not. I spoke with Ralph Himmelsbach, who was involved in the case. He actually was not, as Bruce had pointed, he was not the case agent, although he kind of held himself out to be. I talked to him, and Ralph told me it was absolutely false. There was no information in any of the FBI reports about Cooper inspecting a packing card, and no statement from any of the witnesses that aligned with that. So I don't know. I don't see why Tosaw would make it up. And I don't understand how Tosaw would even know there was such a thing as a packing card. Even people who, use parachutes as emergency escape devices in military transports, they don't even know there's a packing card. Riggers do, and sport parachuters do, because they have to get the rigging card signed every 6 months on the reserve by licensed rigger. They have to get it inspected to do that. But I think Cooper had two choices. I think they were both the same canopy, and you couldn't have chosen a better canopy for what he did. The C9 canopy, unlike most sport canopies of that era, it's a round canopy, 28 feet in diameter, but unlike the sport canopies, which had the suspension lines sewn into attachment points along the skirt of the canopy, this had the suspension lines running all the way through the top and down the other side, so they're continuous, which gives it an incredible amount of durability and resiliency. And that's the one parachute that's not going to be destroyed in a high-speed opening.
So I guess the takeaway here is that the whole idea of D.B. Cooper jumping out of the jet at 200 miles an hour, there's absolutely no reason to think that that parachute would fail, the C9 canopy would fail.
Absolutely not. There's a little bit of physics involved. The energy dissipated during an opening is proportional to the square of the velocity. So, something opening at 100 miles an hour, it's not correct to think 200 miles an hour is twice the stress. It's 4 times the stress. And the sport canopies that I jump probably would not survive an opening at above 200 miles an hour. They're not designed for it. But the C9 absolutely could take it, and has done it many times in various escapes from military aircraft.
So let me ask you this. How difficult would it be for him to deploy the parachute? It seems like that's kind of an obvious thing, like this is the ripcord, make sure I know where this thing is, so when I jump, pull the ripcord. Is there any reason to believe that he, would have been incapable of pulling the ripcord once jumping it 200 miles an hour?
Let me, to answer that, there's a short answer and a long answer, and I'll copy both of them. And by the way, when Eric asks people not to handle things up here, I'll make an exception for the parachute. Feel free to handle it. Just don't pull that silver handle that's the ripcord. But feel free to try it on and turn it around and make sure you're right. This is an NB8 Navy container. NB stands for Naval Backpack. There are 2 commonly used Navy emergency parachutes in the last 4 or 5 decades, 6 decades. And that's the NB8 and NB6. There is no such thing, and I don't take great pride in splitting hairs here. there's some people in the various forms that get all pushed out of shape if somebody uses the wrong nomenclature. I don't. I'm just pointing it out to show you that you could go down a rabbit hole if you're trying to look for an NB8 canopy. There's no such thing. There's no NB8 canopy. There's no NB6 canopy. Those are referring to the backpack, the harness, which is what you fasten yourself in the container, which holds the parachute. Common Navy practice was okay, and then the NB series is really different. The Air Force one has a snap that's not sliding on anything, and it's very obvious how to connect. This is quite a bit different. You don't expect your chest snap to be able to slide up and down, but this is how the Navy one works. I think it's cheaper to manufacture it this way, and apparently reliable, and the leg straps would come through there. Okay, all Cooper had to do to survive this jump is simply stand on the stairs, look forward, pull this handle. It'll extract pins from the back of the, I'll show you this. Really hard to get these pins out. Okay, you'll see here a stainless steel cable to which is swaged pins which go through cones. I don't know if it's that obvious here. This is a rigger seal right here. It's a piece of thread with a smashed piece of lead which has the rigger's initials on it, or at least the numbers that correspond to his license. Okay, so all you have to do is stand on the stairs, look forward, pull the ripcord. That will extract the pins. A very powerful spring-loaded pilot chute will pop out. It'll catch the wind. It will extract the canopy, which will slowly inflate, pull you up the stairs, and then all you have to do is descend. So I think had Cooper exited that way, his survival is almost certain unless he ran into power lines or drowned.
Okay, so you're basically saying that assuming he pulls the ripcord, he's almost certain to have survived, then landed on the ground alive.
Yes, and I'll explain if he didn't exit in my preferred way, what might have happened, and it's still, I think, a survivable jump. This is a And the reason I suggested that way of exiting the 727 aircraft is based on a conversation I had with Dr. Joe Leaker, who is, without any dispute, the most complete he's done the most complete documentation and historical analysis of covert airline operations that were under the purview of the CIA. He's written books about it. He's published articles about it. And I asked him many, many years ago, probably, when was the first Cooper convention? 2011?
2011 was the first symposium.
I called him before that and said, Professor Leaker, he's a prof at the University of Texas. Were 727s ever used for military operational jumps? He said no, but they were used in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And I asked him to explain, and he said Southern Air Transport, which is one of the two most notorious CIA airlines, the other was Air America. And he said Southern Air Transport converted one of their 727s to be an aerial delivery vehicle to drop cargo or people. And the idea was they would offer it either lease or purchase or converting people's existing 727s to be able to do this. The purpose was you could covertly fly as an airliner and drop things. You could drop sensors, beacons, people, cargo, but appeared to be, for all practical purposes, just another 727 flying over the country, probably at night if you're going to do these kind of operations. He said that although they did do simulated military drops in Thailand, they never used it operationally. He said there was no reason to. They had far better jump ships. There was no reason to pretend you were a covert airliner over a declared war zone, basically. So he said, you know, the drops were made over Korat, Thailand, but it was never used operationally. You'll find a lot of articles that dispute that, but I trust Joe's research absolutely. So the other thing that could have happened, the one reason I talked about this preferred way of exiting, I asked Joe Leaker, is there any evidence about any of these 727 drops? The evidence, I've got a copy of a videotape copy of a film. I can send you the video file. And he did, and it later got published on YouTube. And it shows Southern Air Transport kind of advertising. It's a film I think they did to generate publicity for their capabilities and their operations and so forth. And it shows military jumpers. I see in the Boeing 727 that did the operations over Korat, Thailand, had very nice openings, even though the plane was flying pretty fast. I judged the speed to be roughly 170 knots, and that's, you can see a chase plane that's doing, I guess, some other photographing of the 727, and I happen to know a fair amount about that chase plane. It's a converted Beech 18, it had west wind, company turtle props on it. It's basically, I can look at the flat position on the chase plane and get a pretty good guess at what the speed they were operating at. So I would expect the openings at that speed to be really violent, but they weren't. They weren't at all. The parachutes opened and kind of formed what would look like a squid body, an elongated, inflated tube, and the suspension lines looked like the tentacles. And then, as time passed, it inflated more and more and more, but the overall opening was pretty gentle, in my opinion. So I thought, gee, all Cooper had to do is stand on the back of the stairs, pop that pilot chute out, and you get the exact same kind of exit departure. No stability worries, no tumbling worries. His only worry after that is just, what do I do when I get down?
Well, let me ask you this. Being it's a round canopy, my understanding is that it's an unsteerable parachute. The guy's basically going along for the ride in the wind. What can you say about that? Is there any, does he have any kind of ability to control or steer it in any manner whatsoever? Is he literally just pretty much going along for the ride?
In an unmodified C9 canopy, you're definitely going along for the ride. There is no forward propulsion at all. It's strictly a drag device, not an airfoil, and it will come down and straight down. And when I say straight down, if the wind's moving, it's in that column of wind, and so it's going to come straight down, but straight down will be an angle due to the wind velocity. There were something called four-line release systems that the military put on some C9s. I don't know if they were on these ones, but I can tell you from experience they don't do much. The four-line release system was designed to let pilots steer the canopy and avoid obstacles. And what the four-line release system did on the military parachutes, there were various versions of it. Some had a little link, some had tape, Velcro tape you could pull. But basically what it did, it released four lines at the rear of the parachute, which let air spill out behind you. And then by hauling on the risers, either the right or left riser, you could have a little differential to the flow that exited behind you, and that would give you a little bit of turning moment. But I've used the four-line release system on a 26-foot Navy conical, which descends for all practical purposes about the same as the C9. I had an emergency where I had to cut away from a Falcon parachute and use it was all military surplus gear back then, I couldn't afford it any better. And I had to cut away and deploy my 26-foot Navy conical reserve. And when it came out, all the lines were intact, but it had a way that I could remove the connections on those four lines that were needed for forward propulsion. But I'll tell you, all it did is really allow you to orient yourself. You weren't going against any strong headwinds. I would estimate the propulsion speed of doing the four-line release maybe 4 or 5 miles an hour max. So if the wind's blowing 10 miles an hour, sure, you've got a little bit of advantage because you're only going to go backwards at 5 miles an hour. But your ability to really maneuver those parachutes, those round parachutes through the four-line release system was kind of a joke. Now the modern parachutes, the flat ones that have two surfaces and inflate, people call them squares, they're rectangular, not square, but you get the idea. Those are real airfoils. I can fly miles. If I have about a 3-to-1 body ratio, so if I get out at 15,000 feet, I can fly, I don't know, 9 miles and direct where I'm going. So Cooper didn't have that advantage. He was going where the wind took him that night, period, whether he had the four-line release or not. And besides, at night, your chances of seeing an obstacle to avoid it are extremely low. I made a few night jumps, I made a few water jumps. Someone asked me, would you make the Cooper jump? I'd have to be really desperate. I'd have to have a really big payoff. But it's not a certain death jump. I mean, not even close to a certain death jump. And let me explain the other thing. Let's say Cooper didn't know about this preferred way of exiting, and he just jumped. Chances are at night, without a really good horizon and azimuth reference, you would get into a wild tumble. People think, oh, I can sense what's straight up and down. I can sense if I'm tilting. Well, you can if there's no acceleration, but think about this. If it was that simple, airplanes wouldn't have to have these complicated instruments. They could just hang a pendulum in the middle of the cockpit and just keep that thing centered. But what happens is when you accelerate, that pendulum will move, and then well, have you changed your attitude or you just accelerated? You can't resolve that ambiguity. So at night, if he jumped out, the slightest bit of asymmetry in free fall will cause you to turn. You'll either, yaw, pitch, or roll. And in pitch and roll by getting a very symmetrical body position. But you have no idea about azimuth. You could be turning unless you have a heading reference to fixate on and adjust your body to hold that reference. You're going to get into a horizontal spin, which, by the way, I did many times trying to learn how to free fall. Back when I learned how to free fall, there was no such thing as tandem jumps. There was no such thing as accelerated free fall, where an instructor or two would exit with you and pull you stable. They basically put you through three static line jumps so you could get familiar with parachute operation, and then threw you out of the airplane at a higher altitude, basically told you to try to get stable. I'll tell you, it was terrifying. The first few times I did that, I ended up in really violent tumbling spins. I mean, I couldn't tell up from down. Things were going so fast. And they had told me, after 2 attempts to get stable, if you can't get stable, pull the ripcord, because if you wait much longer, you will be centrifuged into unconsciousness. So I did pull, and it obviously, because I'm here, every time I pulled, it opened and I landed safely. But a few times, I opened in really violent, out of control attitudes and dynamics, and I was sure that thing was going to wrap around me and I was going to plummet to my death. But it didn't happen. The parachute system works really well. It's designed to open even if the jumper is tumbling. And so I think even if D.B. Cooper exited, didn't know about pulling right away, got into a violent spin, I think all he had to do is find that cord and pull it, and he'd been okay, he'd landed alive, unless of course he drowned.
Which is what I was going to ask about next, because it seems to me that the real danger in terms of the sky jump is not so much what happens in the air, it's more a matter of what happens when he lands. Specifically, what happens if he lands in water, Columbia River, Vancouver Lake, something like that. How difficult would that be for a parachutist to survive?
I think a water landing at night would be extremely difficult to survive. Now you think, well, gee, all you have to do is take off the harness and swim to shore. It's just not that easy. I've done a couple of night jumps to get my D license. You only had to do one, but I did a couple. And I've done a couple of water jumps. I've never done a night and water jump. The night jumps I did were, kind of sugar-coated. They were bright moon, and we had a lot of lights at the drop zone. The water jumps were bright, clear day with all kinds of chase boats and pickup boats around. So they didn't pose a huge danger. But all those things at once at night, the chance of landing in water, the chance of hitting power line. Power lines scare the hell out of me because you cannot see them. All you can see is the poles. And if you're doing an off-drop zone landing, of course, at the drop zone, I know where all the hazards are. But let's say for some screw-up that I did on my exit position, or the pilot called it wrong or something like that, I end up way off the drop zone and landing. I'm looking like crazy for power poles because I cannot see the lines and I don't want to go across them. And if you're out in the country, sometimes there's huge spans between those giant towers. So there's a lot of things that could get you on the ground, including landing on a rock, breaking your leg, breaking your pelvis. But I think the chances of Cooper landing in the Columbian drowning are really low. The guy who goes by the screen name of Georger, he posts mostly, very seldom, I don't know if he's ever on Facebook, but he's on the D.B. Cooper forum. He's a scientist, a smart guy. And he did a crude, sort of back of the envelope analysis of how much surface area was occupied by drownable bodies of water, mainly the Columbia, over the area where Cooper could reasonably believe to have landed. It's a really tiny percentage. The chances of him landing in that, I think, were like 1% or something. So I think that's a reasonably good analysis, and I think the chances that he drowned are really low, and I think the analysis of the diatoms makes it even less likely.
What about trees? Say the guy lands up 70, 80 foot tall tree. How easy or how difficult would it be for him to rappel down from the trees?
It would be hard. I was taught to deploy my reserve and then climb down, shinning down the reserve lines because your main parachute's holding you up there. It's solid. You can't get that out of the tree with all the suspended weight that you represent. I think it would be very hard because he didn't carry a reserve. There was no way to attach a reserve. You'll see on the NBA on the front of it, there's no D-rings to attach a reserve to. So he jumped with just the main parachute. I don't know if he had enough rope with him. He had some rope and some lines that he cut. I think if he landed in a really tall tree, he'd be in pretty serious trouble. You could, if you thought you could survive a 20-foot fall or something, you could get out of your canopy and, get out of your harness and try to get down, hang on and get your body as low as you could and then drop. But I think the landing in a tree would be a serious problem. Of course, then he would have been found.
Yeah, I guess that's the other, hit the ground at 100 miles an hour, at 122 miles an hour. What happens to his body? What happens to the bag of money tied to him? I mean, I would assume that it just kind of explodes all over. That money's blowing around in the wind, and there's a mess of other stuff out there.
Yeah, I think the parachute would remain intact if he went in as a no-pull. I think the chances are very high that it would have been discovered. I mean, first of all, I bet there were a lot of people out there, especially hunters in the area, who heard that someone parachuted with $200,000 are out there looking for a body at $200,000. Also, vultures are really, really good at spotting decaying corpses of anything. And I think after a while, hunters would be looking for corpses after a few days after the stench started. So I think if Cooper went in as a no-pull, his body would have been found by hikers, hunters, searchers. He would not be buried in the ground unless he fell into a marsh or some sort of peat bog or something like that. And the gear, the metal stuff on this parachute, first of all, there's a huge steel springs inside, it's really big, inside the pilot chute. That's compressed when it's in here, but when the thing deploys, the spring's about this long. There's also cadmium-plated steel hardware all over here. There's also an abundance of stainless steel hardware in here. That flex housing on the ripcord is stainless steel. There's other stainless steel components here. I guarantee you 100 years from now, there's going to be plenty for a metal detector to find. The reason I'm mentioning all this is, unless Cooper died on landing, he would, I think, bury his chute. There was no reason to take it with him, none at all. Every reason to hide it. And you'd only need to hide it superficially, just enough so that air searchers couldn't see and then center their search on where you abandoned it. You wouldn't have to have it hidden for all time, because if they found it, it wouldn't tell them what your identity was, or who you were, or anything about you. If you brought your own parachute rig and it was found, that would be traceable. So,
let me ask you, how heavy is that thing?
40 pounds.
Okay. Yeah, it seemed pretty heavy. What about a reserve parachute?
20 pounds, 15.
Okay, so basically between the main parachute and the reserve, typically you're looking somewhere 50 to 60 pounds is a fair estimate. Okay, so it sounds like to me that you believe that based upon what you know about the case and what you know about skydiving and so forth, you think that he likely survived.
Well, there's a number of reasons. Martin and Ravi has analyzed the records of aircrew escapes during World War II over military bombing missions and so forth. And those were actually far more difficult escapes than Cooper made. They were out of B-17s and B-24s, B-26s that got shot up over Europe and North Africa. And they were often spinning out of control. They were often at altitude 20,000 feet. The U.S. bombed during the day, the British bombed at night. But the vast, vast majority of people who actually got out of the airplane when they had parachutes survived. And they had no parachuting experience at all. So I think, and you look at the only skyjacker parachutist who died was that poor guy in the Philippines who made his own parachute out of bed sheets. Obviously failed when he jumped out of the airplane, but all the others survived. So when you say Cooper died, and you look at the evidence of World War II aircrew and subsequent military parachute escapes, and you look at the history of the other copycat skyjackers, it would be extremely unlikely, I think, that he died in the landing or the jump.
All right, well, I know there's got to be a few questions out here. So let me come down here, walk them
And
back.
I can tell you I jumped from a DC-9 Airliner in 2006. It's not that tough a jump, it's really not. You know, the exit speed's a little higher than I would prefer, but other than that, it's just another jump.
Hi, thank you so much for your perspective. This is really helpful. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you did some night dives, but they were rather sugar-coated. And I'm just wondering, have there been other night dives attempted where the factors were rather similar to when you were parachuted? Thanks so much.
I don't think sport parachutists do what D.B. Cooper did, and I don't think smoke jumpers do because they do their jumps during the day. So a wilderness jump at night, I think that would be the sole purview of special ops military people. I've never heard of any sport parachutists doing it. I wouldn't do it, it's just too risky. And the smoke jumpers don't jump at night, as far as I know, they never do.
Okay, we got a question over here.
Flaps, gear down, do not exceed 10,000 feet. That's the perfect setup for jumping. In fact, might have been similar to what the Southern Air Transport pilots used. And 15 degree, most people don't know the difference between flap, elevator, air brakes, leading and spoilers. You know, they're all the same, they're all flaps. They don't know that flaps are put down. They just said flaps are up or down. They don't know there's degrees of deflection. Most people don't know that 10,000 feet to 12,000 feet is a rough altitude that you shouldn't exceed if you're not on oxygen because it will start to impair your cognitive abilities. So, you know, the fact that he had all that just pat tells me it wasn't the first time he was around jumping, and it wasn't the first time he was around 727. 727 has a unique detent for the 15-degree flat position. It's different than other airplanes. So just, there's a lot of things that say he really knew what he did. Fly unpressurized, gear down, flaps 15 degrees, do not exceed 10,000 feet. That's a lot of very specific demands, very specific.
You hungry? Okay, so we've got the lunch break coming up here, and just across the street we have Basolo pizza and other stuff there for you. So it's just across the street to grab a bite to eat. I know there's some snacks and stuff here as well at the theater, but very convenient. So I want to thank you, Mark, for taking the time to talk to us about the he's a good guy. I love Mark. We've been friends for a while, and the guy's a rock star as far as all this is concerned. So with that, we'll take a lunch break here. We'll be back at 1 o'clock, and feel free to cross the street and go to Basolo and grab a bite of pizza. Mark, yes? Just one more thing. I can't take credit for any original discoveries in this case. I give Eric huge credit for getting on this. Eric and other people who are here and tracking down the metallurgy. I give Tom huge credit. I really haven't done anything original in this case, except I did coin the term Cooper vortex. And the reason I think it's apt is when you get near the edge, it draws you in, and when you get near the center, you're spinning so fast you don't know what's going on. So feel free to use the term. I'm not claiming a trademark or copyright in it, but I do get some personal pleasure out of seeing how it's endured. All right, wonderful. All right, we'll